Okay, so this talk begins part 2 of Left Hand Apotheosis, Transhumanism, and the Rulerships Quest for Godhood. In part 1, we explored the mainstream definition of transhumanism and applied it to the Hegelian dialectic, or problem-reaction-solution, dialectical technique of social manipulation. We saw how the paradigm, or the dogmatic adherence to the paradigm of scientific materialism, provided the problem. That transhumanism itself was the reaction to these problems caused by scientism, and that the occult elite's post-human globalized society was the preconceived solution. We saw how, much like other religions, scientific materialism itself was held together by group assumptions, that allegiance to the paradigm was held in higher esteem than actual experiential results, and that born from this dogmatic ideology came the reactionary movement of transhumanism. We saw that transhumanism's most popular and influential proponents lacked true holistic intelligence, and were broken men and women who were deliberately propped up and paraded as experts, authorities, and intellectual visionaries on the subject, and that this, and the consensus immersion in gross physicality, the increasing reliance on technology, an incorrect and myopic view of history, and the three instilled social dynamics of collectivism or hive mentality were all artificially instilled reactionary social trends leading humanity toward a transhuman future. We explored that the transhumanist movement openly proclaims that it wishes to transform what it is to be human. And because the dogmatic adherence to scientific materialism is so severe, transhumanists believe their ideas of so-called bettering humanity are considered to be, and designed to appear to be, the only possible option for moving forward. When the illusion of no other choice is sufficiently instilled, that choice is consensually made. To elaborate on this point, because the occult rulership in their own way adhere to universal law, they largely avoid infringing upon free will by not directly forcing technology on others. Although the covert integration of nanotechnology via environmental factors is most definitely an ongoing practice, something we will cover later in this presentation, yet nonetheless, the rulership still focus the bulk of their attention on crafting a proper social environment that will lead people to accept the integration of technology into their lives, and eventually even their bodies willingly, by choice of their own volition. Some may call this manipulation coercion, and that it still represents a violation of universal law, and they may have a good point to say so. Nonetheless, the massive amounts of willful ignorance, of complex ignorance on humanity's part, certainly is a huge factor that offsets much of the rulership's infringements upon free will. In a paradigm where people think of themselves as having no power, that their life is short, unfair, and ends with infinite death, when they are told that humans arose out of the war to keep breathing, eating, and reproducing, and are a mutation of randomness and ruthlessness, the product of a kind of accidental mix of chemicals that led to a primordial slime that eventually evolved into Homo sapiens, living only to pass on genetic material to their progeny, and that they are inevitably heading toward an unknown end, most likely eternal nothingness. When they adhere to such a perverse paradigm, then they ignorantly and naively see transhumanist technologies as a solution, a way to outsmart the unfortunate pitfalls of nature and rise above them. They see death as something to be cheated, and that the prospective void of eternal nothingness that awaits a brain ceasing to fire its synapses can be avoided. That intellect could be infinitely enhanced and combined with all others in collective unity and oneness. All these contrived ideas each function like transhuman carrots hanging from the stick of scientific materialism, as humanity unwittingly gives chase into the trap of their own enslavement, altogether losing what it is to be human. There is of course nothing wrong with wanting to be something more, and even nothing wrong with wanting to eventually transcend the human form and become something even greater. But how can one become something more than human if they have yet to figure out how to holistically be a human in the first place? One of the primary selling points being pushed by the figureheads of transhumanism is the fantasy of a future technological utopia, a future type of paradise where man would be relieved of all pain, conflict, and suffering. Not only is such thinking supremely naive, but it also represents a fundamental misapprehension of the nature of life and of growth. The promotion of this premise of less effort, less pain, and more happiness is in direct opposition to how human beings approach reality when their consciousness has not been artificially conditioned to perceive strictly from five-sense reality in a societal environment that promotes instant gratification through minimal effort. For indeed there is something much more important than living in blissful, effortless happiness for all eternity. And to answer what that something might be in a wise and adequate manner, we must ironically refer to science as it originally existed in antiquity. After spending a large portion of Part 1 elucidating the problems and shortcomings of science in its current degraded manifestation, it is only proper to continue by first exploring science as it existed in the ancient world. And in doing so, we shall see the sheer depth, beauty, and astonishing wisdom that was devised by our ancestors. Wisdom that can be unlocked within ourselves today, as the veracity of such early truths was so great that they exist on eternally within us. They are one with the very essence that ensouls who we are. Today's division of essential learning into all its various competitive and non-cooperative fragments has destroyed the synthesis of this knowledge. Learning has been divided into countless isms and ologies, departments and subdepartments to such a fractured degree that these disciplines no longer optimally serve us in a constructive manner. In the ancient world, science, religion, and philosophy were all one thing. Spiritual matters and the physical sciences were fundamentally unified in a kind of universal science that represented a more holistic attitude in regards to how man approached not only his life on earth, but the greater journey of the human soul. And it is the journey of the human soul that remains, despite the current consensus paradigm, the most valid and important consideration in the life of the individual, and whether humanity realizes it or not, the most important component in the life and future of the collective. In facilitating such a cooperative role with himself and nature, and the vast living universal organism of which he was a part, early man patterned his approach to life after the great teacher that was nature, and early science was undoubtedly founded upon this relationship. The two oldest sciences known to our world are alchemy and astrology, and in exploring these two great scientific arts, we will see that they in fact work hand in hand with one another, and that in our exploration and integration of both, we will come to understand that they not only reveal great truths, but they help the individual achieve what is sometimes known as palingenesis, or the resurrection of the soul from the material organism. Indeed, these are the philosophical arts of spiritual rebirth, of true spiritual awakening, and by their usage, the journey of the human soul can once again move to the forefront of human aspirations, so that the individual can actively and consciously contribute to their own evolution. Now, it should be said that these ancient systems are by no means the only way to spiritual liberation. The individual contains all the tools necessary within himself to facilitate a boundless relationship between himself and ultimate reality by virtue of his own unique felt experiences. We refer to these systems, however, with the understanding that they were devised by fellow human beings who, like the modern seeker, were seekers in their own right, and honorably devised philosophies of being from their own genuine desire for truth. And thus by reviewing what they compiled for the benefit of their fellow human beings, we can, with the proper approach and attitude, derive value from what they discovered. Value that can, however, only be estimated on a personal basis. And with that in mind, we continue. The genesis of alchemy and astrology extends far back into the ancient world, of which we know next to nothing about, back into the obscurity of prehistory. According to some of the earliest records known to exist, alchemy and astrology were once considered as being divinely revealed to man, so that by unlocking the secrets they contained, man could once again regain his lost estate. Alchemy today, of course, has degenerated into chemistry, and because such chemists only study the material aspect of the elements, they can only ever at best hope to unlock a fraction of the mystery they contain, as they will never see past the veil of the material illusion of the elements, or the veil of Isis, as it is known in mystical traditions. Astrology has similarly descended into astronomy, and astronomers ridicule the dreams and visions of ancient seers, mystics, and sages, assigning their what they consider to be fantasies to the realm of superstition. Indeed, no matter how brilliant the intellectual capacities of today's scientists, they will never pass behind the veil that separates the seen from the unseen, the unreal from the real, until that is they develop and utilize a holistic array of their own faculties of perception, until they uphold the primacy of their own felt experience, until they mature to a level of consciousness that for the first time takes their own search for the authentic, their unique philosophy of being seriously enough to uphold their own perceptions, not worrying or adhering to the greater pressures of group mentality. And they must do this while at the same time developing a kind of humility that upholds the validity inherent to all life experiences, human or non-human, in the quest to unfold and grow. In our analysis of ancient philosophy in the context of alchemy and astrology, it is necessary to reiterate the importance of suspending our beliefs. To not believe or disbelieve such information, but instead to hold these ideas, to consider them in light of our own felt experience, taking care to think and feel out such things for any validity we may derive from them. The seers and sages of the ancient world took tremendous care in their quest for truth, and the knowledge they attained should be approached with an equal honor and integrity in our hearts and minds when considering the wisdom that they accrued and formulated into scientific practice. Perhaps the most fundamental difference between ancient peoples and modern man is that ancient man saw all of existence as being alive, that the universe was a vast living organism, and that all things were inhabited and populated by living beings. Deity was not some faraway, externalized concept. Man's gods were in the trees and hills. They were the good and rational intelligences residing in the wind and rocks and waters all around him. Life was existence, and existence was life. Man intuitively knew that all of space was populated by intelligent and rational creatures, beings who had a definitive existence, and their thoughts, feelings, and desires, their lives were equally valid experiences in nature. Ancient man had a common kinship with the intelligences of nature, a kinship that modern man has largely forgotten. The concepts and practices contained within the two great arts of alchemy and astrology validated something else that early man intuitively knew, namely the great truth that man had his origins in the stars, that he originally existed in a universal state of being, living at one with the gods. Ancient man sensed that he was once fashioned in a kind of heavenly unification, that within his original composition was a divine nature, and in this condition he once dwelled above the world in a luminous state of sacred existence. And from his view on high, divine man looked down upon the world through the darkness of space, and he saw there a great mystery. And in pondering this strange mystery, there grew within heavenly man a kind of divine curiosity. And he then realized within himself that there was indeed something much more important to him than being happy forever. And so it was on the basis of this very innately human desire for exploration, for the seeking of new experiences and new knowledge, that man consciously and willingly set out on his journey. And with this willing departure from eternal blessedness began the great cycle of human existence. Ancient peoples recognized the ubiquitous human desire to explore the unknown because they felt this desire within themselves. And it was for this reason that they did not have a fall in their theology in the sense that we know of it today, this concept of man being driven out of paradise. Ancient man did not feel that such a thing was true. He did not conceive of himself as an unwilling, involuntary exile, nor did he intuitively feel that he was being punished for his original sin, as religions today would have him think. He also most certainly did not feel that he arose by accident, for no reason, in a randomly mechanized dead universe, as science would have him think. Man instead went forth on his journey in the spirit of adventure, to explore the unknown, because such is the nature of man. It is indeed the nature of life itself. Man wanted to know what was below, beyond, and around him. He wanted to forge for himself his own path, and to gain achievement on that path. to gain personal triumphs of the kind that can only come through his own efforts. He wanted triumph over limitation. Because again, there is something much more important than being happy forever. And this more important thing is to go forth and learn. It is a natural instinctive desire within man to learn by experiences that are forged in the face of the unknown. When left to our own devices and not ruined by malicious conditioning, we are all learners and seekers, and life is a questing for the discovery of value. Life is man gradually gaining personal victory over darkness and ignorance. Life is the unfolding of some glorious and mysterious game, a divine type of game. And it is in the spirit of this great concept that early man approached his life. He approached the world in the spirit of courage and curiosity, fully realizing, accepting, and embracing the dangers and hazards of his reality. Because with every potential danger and hazard that he faced, there was also a potential victory. A victory that taught him and awarded him with new knowledge, insight, and wisdom. Every hardship was an opportunity to be greater than circumstance. And these feelings and thoughts and the spirit of human adventure, according to the doctrines of antiquity, compelled man to embark out upon the mystery of the world. He went forth out of his state of innocence and on a divine quest to attain virtue. Out of a state of static potential and down upon the mysterious spheres of dynamism and potency. Out of a state of balance and into a state of imbalance to rise himself back into balance. Out of the light and into the darkness to illuminate that darkness through the illumination of himself. He embarked upon a great mystery, the mystery of self-knowing. And because of this quest, even biblical scripture manages to tell us that in the fullness and course of time, man will rise to a state of being greater than the angels, as our angelic brethren did not go forth, but instead chose to stay in the comforts of their heavenly home. So divine man willingly left his abode in the heavens and traveled down upon the strange mystery of the spheres to begin this great experiment of living. And the first thing man had to accomplish before he could adequately function in any given sphere or world was to build for himself a body. He could not move from one state of matter to another, from one configuration of energy to another, unless he had fashioned an instrument within himself by which he could be attuned and adjusted to each state of being through which he would be passing. When man moved downward from his original state, the old mystery philosophies tell us that man did not lose his divinity, nor did he cast it off. Rather, he simply enclosed it, or concealed it within himself. He put on new vestments, but the same divine being was still within them. The God within him did not die, it did not leave him, rather it was restricted by the vestments he took upon himself. And these vestments were derived by descending through the various parts of the solar system, descending through the various planetary spheres and the circular planes of their orbits. And as the soul descended through the planetary orbits, so says a multitude of ancient doctrines from antiquity, the god or keeper of each planet bestowed upon the soul a gift, veiled as a restriction upon man's divinity. As man traveled through the eye of the rings of Saturn, Saturn bestowed upon man's soul the potential virtue of prudence. Saturn did not give man prudence, rather he gave him the potential to become prudent. Saturn imparted this veil of prudence which locked the pure consciousness of man inside himself under such a vestment, so that in time man could achieve victory over this restricted veil only by eventually becoming prudent, by outgrowing his saturnal confinement. Next man descended into the sphere of Jupiter, and the god Jupiter bestowed upon him a secondary restriction, a garment to be placed atop the first undergarment, and man thus gained the power to become reasonable in his judgments by taking upon himself this garment of unreason. With time and the acquisition of wisdom, man could overcome this veil of Jupiter by becoming reasonable, by developing the ability to rationalize and appropriately think things through, to philosophize and idealize, to alas gain the virtue of judgment only by achieving victory over the veil of darkness bequeathed to him by Jupiter. Man then descended further into the orbit of Mars, and Mars covered man with a third restrictive garment, a garment to be placed atop the previous two undergarments, and such was the vestment of courage and fortitude. Again, not courage itself, but the opportunity to become courageous, to initially experience the pain of recklessness, the unwise and impatient use of courage, until one day man would rise to overcome the veil of Mars, and alas attain for himself the true virtue of courage, the power of bravery and perseverance, to stand tall under the pressures and stresses of his affairs. And then still further man descended until he reached the orbit of the sun, and the sun bestowed upon man another garment to be placed over the previous three. Man was then enveloped in a halo of light by the power of the great solar sphere, and he was then gifted the potential of vitality, the power of energy, the ability to be sustained and supported by this energy. Man could learn how to use his vitality wisely and not frivolously, to utilize his life force for the betterment of himself and for those around him. Next, man entered the orbit of Venus, and the spirit of Venus imparted to him beauty. He gained the potential to love, to sacrifice for the betterment of others with affection, to forget the selfish needs of himself in charity and service of those whom he loved. And this garment was placed atop all others, and man was beginning to become weighed down with all his numerous vestments. Next, man came to Mercury, and here he was given the ability to become skillful, quick, witty, and cunning. He was granted the potential of humor, because without a certain amount of wit and lightness, all such burdens previously bestowed upon him might perhaps be too heavy. And then man descended to the orbit of the moon, and here the garment of imagination was imparted to him. And again it was placed atop all others, and this potential for imagination was the power that in time would break and unlock all the binds and boundaries that held him back. Once developed and realized, imagination would liberate him and release him into a larger living reality. And now as man was well covered with these 7 heavy restrictive vestments, he was burdened and loaded down with such vestments. His load was heavy, and his divinity was well concealed within himself. So much so, in fact, that he had now forgotten his divine beginnings, and would only rediscover this divinity within himself by attaining through action and experience the virtues of which he originally left his divine state of innocence to discover. Heavily burdened with these 7 adornments, man had fell downward into a state of material ignorance and generation. He was born into an earthly existence, wrapped and concealed in 7 restrictive garments, vestments contained within himself, hidden deep within his material vessel, which is of course his physical body, the agent that was to be his interface with this world of action and dynamic experience. Each vestment was a potential power of his soul, the 7-fold or septenary powers of the soul, potentialities of consciousness within himself only to be discovered and adequately and wisely utilized through his own effort, restrictions upon himself to be unlocked and transmuted into the gifts that they truly represented. These septenary powers can of course be linked to the 7 chakras, and a clue to their order and correspondence is contained within this astrotheological narrative, as man is a microcosm of the solar system. This narrative also contains clues to the formation of the solar system itself, and even the development of man as the dominion of each planet asserted itself through time. Perhaps these are issues best left for a future presentation, however. What we are concerned with here are the 7 restrictions of the planets to be transmuted into the gifts that they truly represent through man's attainment of virtue. Initially, such gifts were burdens of ignorance and darkness that enclosed man's soul within himself, burdens that he carried into the sleep of matter, the spiritual death that was his physical waking existence. And it is in this way that man currently begins his life and faces the many problems of growth, a spiritual infant on a quest for spiritual maturity. We thus see in this great astrotheological narrative, which was intuited, known, and compiled by numerous spiritual traditions of antiquity, that astrology is the study of heavenly bodies in terms of the influential energies that radiate from them, rather than merely examining, as astronomy seeks to do, the physical appearance and construction of cosmological bodies as they move through space. Within astrology is a key to spiritual truths regarding the reality in which we find ourselves, truths to be studied philosophically to better come to know the energetic constitution of which we are comprised. As the 16th century adept Paracelsus said, quote, "Man derives his spirit from the constellations, his soul from the planets, and his body from the elements." Unquote. Astrology is a tool for orientation on a universal or cosmic level, whereby we can align ourselves with the greater plan of the unfoldment of existence and our role in this unfoldment. Until modern man senses and realizes once again that his ultimate destiny is not wholly fulfilled in the small, seemingly linear progression of immediate experiences of which he is familiar, he cannot hope to develop a grander, long-range perspective, capable of inspiring him on a course of constructive conduct, both for himself and for the others who populate the reality in which he shares. This astrotheological narrative also illustrates just how differently ancient man approached the problems to which he was bound. He intuitively realized that man's limitations were not unfortunate consequences or flaws inherent in nature. Rather, these limitations had a purpose. They were in a strange and glorious way a part of the sacred unfoldment, part of the plan of man's living destiny. Early man realized that his shortcomings were transcended from within, that they were overcome through his own attainment of virtue, not doctored from the outside in via the external manipulation of nature itself. Man must thus adjust himself to all of nature, not pompously and naively attempt to adjust all of nature to himself. Man today has become too self-important in an egocentric way, and it is this ego-identification, man's immersion in base consciousness, his self-important, self-aggrandizing attitude that has severed his relationship with the intelligences of nature. Until man again develops a gentle humility that upholds the sacred nature inherent to all living organisms that comprise the totality of physical and metaphysical existence, he is hopelessly doomed to be at opposition with nature, instead of working with nature in the grander unfoldment of himself and the collective human family. He must rekindle his kinship with existence, in order to unfold and grow naturally in truth, with nature as an ally, not a flawed enemy that he must overcome. Man must look to nature philosophically, for seen in the workings of nature are keys to the future progression of the human species. Embodied in nature all around us are the great and sacred cycles of growth, maturity, death, and decay. Each day we witness the sun, God the Father, as he rises in the blue mists of early morning, signifying growth. And then we witness as he becomes God the Son, as he is the great yellow orb sent forth to bear witness to the world by his Father, maturely shining down upon the earth and casting not a shadow from the zenith of his daily arc, or high noon, midday. And at last the sun rests, embodying the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, flaming red at dusk upon the horizon, and then disappears into the decay of darkness, wandering in the underworld, only to triumphantly rise again the next morning, resurrected, born again, renewed from the darkness of death. Through birth, we enter this world of spiritual death, like a seed of great potential buried in the darkness and blackness of the soil, sown in the shadow of our material world. In the dark and bitter cold of winter, the seed hibernates, like the soul quietly enfolded within the denser confines of a material body. A body grossly governed by the five senses of base consciousness, blind to the higher causal forces responsible for the illusory reflection of the materiality that surrounds it. The seed holds within itself the blueprint of its future being, the code of its liberation. Within the tiny seed there lies the potentiality of a towering tree of life. A tree that can, given the proper amount of time and conditions, produce more trees, so that in just one tiny seed lies the potentiality of an entire forest. Like the seed, so too is our future potential within us. Hidden within is the illuminating essence of the central sun, that life force that emanates from the heart of all things. It is our incubating spirit, the spark of singularity deep inside the husk of our material form. A seed transfixed in the darkness of the soil, the darkness of the illusory world. It is in our material ignorance, the shadowed state of living in our world, while carrying the painful burden of not knowing the eternal divinity from whence we came. It is in this state that we come face to face with the depths of our inner darkness, a state obscured from the inner alchemical gold sunken deep inside the womb of the dark earth, a tomb that is the philosophical winter of the soul. We the seed are indeed vulgar gold, and like the seed we must first know death and putrefy before we can germinate, before we can bring to full flower and fruition the potentiality contained within us. Inspired by factors internal and external, intuitively compelled by the early etheric energies of our approaching philosophical spring, the germination of the seed is the germination of our consciousness. And just as the seedling trudges upward through the dark, dense resistance of the soil and gains bearing and groundedness by the anchoring of its roots, so too does our consciousness gauge and calibrate its inner compass, meandering through the shadows of ignorance, turning inward through the depths of our being, seeking the eternal prize nested in the heart of who we truly are, feeding the slow-burning fire that purifies our psycho-spiritual energies, as the base metals, the lead of our saturnal confinement, the tin, that's T-I-N, of our Jovian lack of reason, the iron of our Martian recklessness, the copper of our Venusian passions, the neutrality of our mercurial condition, as the blackened vices of our unconscious self are transmuted, as they are whitened through the evolving action of our inner heat, the elements of conscious awareness transmuted from vices into virtues. In the time of the coming spring, we see the sprouting of our unfolding consciousness, a succession in the order of our transmutation. The hazy shadows of our inner ignorance are gloriously transmuted into the bright and shimmering reflective nature of silver. By the light of the sun and moon, and by the dynamic influences of the elements, the sapling is nourished just as the shimmering state of our self-reflective consciousness is nourished by the contemplation, observation, experimentation, and inner virtues of a world freshly renewed, illuminated by eyes newly opened and honed to recognize truth. Reaching upward, growing by the light of the sun and moon, as we circle day and night, we are now like a young tree, compelled by the actions of the solar heat of our philosophical summer, the self in the process of truly becoming, reaching inward, upward, and outward like the branches of the tree, as we become our most noble and incorruptible, as the silver state, by effort and action to quench our ever-growing thirst for wisdom, gradually becomes gold through the truth of our deeds in the world, by truth in action and in being, the budding and flowering of who we really are. From the flower grows the fruit of our actions, fruits that nourish the world, the alchemical gold of the spirit and soul, forged and ever radiant come autumn, time of the harvest, as we return our vestments to our planetary keepers. The final fruition of a soul triumphing over darkness. From death, shadow, and putrefaction, a rebirth, uniquely becoming life eternal. For now, as the outer fruit ripens on the vine of life and falls to the earth to decay, new seeds are sown, themselves containing immortal life within, to one day navigate the depths of darkness and strive upward toward the fruits of truth, a living story told in the dramas of the following cycle. Because nothing from nothing comes, which is a mystical axiom, alchemy is not the art of making something from nothing. It instead is the art of improving that which already exists from within. It is the art of multiplication, of projection, of germinating and growing the divine seed existent in the heart of all things. It is both a philosophical metaphor and the literal transmutation of base planetary metals into gold, the regeneration of man from ignorance into wisdom. It is a process on the level of the elements, the human, and the divine. It is thus a threefold art, best symbolized by the triangle, three processes, each in three worlds, each three occurring within each three, and it is thus one of the secrets behind the 33rd degree of Freemasonry, the three within each three, equaling 9, the number of divine man, the heart and will in the mind and will in the heart, the mind and heart in the will, a transmutation, a regeneration from the broken shell of a human being into a spiritually alive, self-empowered individual with purpose, insight, wisdom, and truth, with a self-cultivated, newfound seership, one who has given birth to the higher manifestation of who they truly are, one who forwards the power they have attained through truth in action and in being in the world. We thus see that contained within not only alchemy and astrology, but the very rhythms and cycles of nature itself are metaphorical keys, embodiments of living wisdom, that show us the true cyclical art of man's evolutionary process. The point being made is not that early man nor his lifestyle were perfect. Rather, he had hardships and struggles just as we do today, although the darkness that befalls man today very much appears to have gained a kind of organization and dominion over man in a much more severe manner. Nonetheless, early man at least possessed the proper perspective. He did not see nature as an enemy to overcome. On the contrary, contained within the predicament provided to him by nature was a higher process, a deeper purpose that helped to guide the destiny of man as he embarked out upon a wondrous quest to attain virtue and wisdom, to eventually return the experiential attainment of his virtues to his original divine estate. And such was the purpose inherent to the struggle of earthly living, and ultimately the purpose inherent to the great cycle of human evolution itself. This great cycle of human evolution can be seen as a type of alchemical transmutation, whereby in falling into matter and generation and naively succumbing to the pitfalls of material ignorance, man must meet death. He must come face to face with darkness. He must putrefy before he can individually and eventually collectively transmute himself, his base estate, into alchemical gold. His destiny is to achieve palingenesis on a species-wide level, but he must, by virtue of his own will, rise his material incarnation back into spirit, and in doing so, satisfy that original and innately human desire to forego innocence in order to conquer the mystery of self-knowing, to feed the ever-growing wisdom of the human spirit, and fulfill the universal imperative that calls for evolutionary growth forged in the face of the unknown, contributing to the dynamic work in progress that is existence itself. Mistakes exist to be made, an extremely important consequence of this divine experiment in free will and universal law. In the great cycle of human evolution, the conscious awareness of humanity plunges into the depths of shadow, in a state of material immersion and base consciousness. Man's heart and mind work as completely separate forces, as putrefaction and inhibition befalls man, as the vibratory frequencies of man's constitution descend sympathetically with the greater cosmic cycles, and man partakes not of his higher sacred essences of celestial illumination, but instead operates in base awareness, governed by his lower senses and carnal appetites. In such a state of incubation, man forgets who he really is. The unsatisfactory nature of his condition is compounded by his total ignorance of its solution. Pain and fear of more pain become the motivating factors of the day, and adherence to natural law breaks down. Man abuses his gifts, as his harmonic relationship to the natural forces that surround him are directly proportionate to his virtuous use of the forces that comprise him. The darkness within him invokes darkness around him, and man turns to this darkness to further his now degenerated desires. It is possible, through the skillful scientific integration and application of specific formulae devised by the initiates and adepts of the ancient world, to invoke and indeed employ the services of spiritual entities for benevolent or malevolent purposes, and such a practice is known as ceremonial magic. The magician, either white, black, or gray, by the aid of ritual practices and devices, can, by the power contained in certain hieroglyphic figures, words, and rituals, come to gain control of, or collaborate with, the invisible inhabitants, benevolent or malevolent, of the elements, known as elementals, as well as the demoniacal entities of the astral world. The complex workings of the ceremonial magic practiced in antiquity was by no means evil. However, the power contained in such practices tempted the darker hearts among men, And out of the practices of ceremonial magic arose perversions of the art that led to the formation of several false schools of sorcery, who practiced what is commonly known today as black magic, and its current elitist manifestation, sometimes known as ritual illuminism. It is quite possible that the wide-scale usage of such black magic in antediluvian or pre-flood Atlantis upset the laws of nature to such a degree as to in part contribute to the cataclysm that swallowed up the great civilization. Later in Egypt, which was a great civilization in its own right regarding its scope of learning and its high level of refined arts and sciences, again furnished an ideal setting for magical practice and experimentation. The ancestors of the black magicians of Atlantis continued to exercise and exploit their magical abilities and superhuman faculties, completely undermining and corrupting the morals of the ancient mysteries, sequestering their knowledge and widening the power gap between themselves and the masses in a scenario that continues to this day, although the manner in which they operate has evolved with the steering of the collective zeitgeist. In ancient Egypt, they established themselves as god-men, were the official link between the people and the gods, and in this way they usurped the positions formerly held by the initiates of the mystery traditions. Initiates who previously held such positions not in a perverse, egotistical, or forceful way, but rather held such positions respectfully, based upon their desire and interest for such knowledge, and upon their levels of attainment, and also because it was recognized that with such knowledge came the possibility for abusing it for selfish reasons. Nonetheless, the perverters of this knowledge eventually gained total control over Egypt's spiritual government. Black magic then dictated the state religion and degraded the intellectual and spiritual activities of the individual by demanding their absolute allegiance to the dogma formulated by the black priestcraft. The pharaoh became a puppet in the hands of a committee of arch-sorcerers elevated to power by the priesthood, just as today our supposed governmental leaders are mere puppets to the occult rulership atop the power pyramid. This ancient and virtually unbroken genetic lineage of dark occultists extends into the present day. The sorcerers of the Egyptian priesthood began the systematic destruction and sequestering of keys to the ancient wisdom, so that most could not have the knowledge necessary to reach adeptship without first becoming one of their order. Although behind the scenes the virtuous protectors of the highest, most sacred knowledge continued to keep the chain of light unbroken in the hearts of men. Nonetheless, the dark occultists perverted and altered the rituals of the mysteries, while at the same time professing to preserve them, so that even when the aspiring initiate passed through the degrees of their order, they were misled and deprived of the high knowledge of which they were so entitled. Phallicism and idolatry was then introduced, whereby the worshipping of images was encouraged, images which were originally intended as symbols for study and meditation. Erroneous and misleading interpretations were assigned to the symbols and systems of the mysteries, and confusing and overly elaborate religions were created to further confuse and bewilder the common man. The masses were deliberately deprived of their birthright to higher understanding, and they then fully fell into ignorance and naivety, eventually becoming enslaved upon the basis of this great knowledge differential. Religious misunderstanding and superstition thus prevailed, and in this way the black magicians gained total dominion over national Egyptian affairs, an illegitimate authority over an ignorant humanity that still continues to this day via a priestcraft that can be traced back from mighty civilization to civilization. One empire under many different names, whose genesis is the black sorcery that brought down the great civilization of Atlantis. A civilization that was likely superior to our modern civilization in nearly every conceivable way. Continuing quite a bit later on from Egypt, ceremonial magic was practiced by the medieval Kabbalists, who were convinced that it was sanctioned by their scriptures. The magical practices of the Kabbalists are founded upon the ancient magical formulas of King Solomon, who has since antiquity been considered by Jewish peoples to be the prince of ceremonial magicians. Among the Kabbalists of the Middle Ages were a great many black magicians who strayed from the more noble and righteous concepts contained in the books of the Kabbalah, namely the Sefer Yetzirah, And such black Kabbalists furthered a magical tradition centered in demonism, sacrificial rituals, and the ritualized invocation of submundane creatures. Seeking power and domination, rare knowledge, and supersensory abilities, they sought control of dark, elemental, and astral spirits in black practices that evolved from early Atlantean sorcery. Yet it is forever the nature of such dark acts that they inevitably lead to the detriment and eventual downfall of the practitioner. As such an individual, unable of controlling his own dark appetites, is not up to the task of governing the clever and tempestuous elemental spirits, as no such demonic spiritual communion is performed without a price. It is in the primary premises of the dark arts that we can perhaps discover a motive, from a metaphysical perspective at least, for the emergence of transhumanist technologies in our modern age, a link that we will momentarily explore. But first we need to more fully understand the primary tenets of black magic. The first tenet of black magic rests upon the truth that the majority of this presentation has been espousing, namely the fact that the visible universe within which we are enfolded has invisible realms that operate behind it, and an initial invisible realm that can be described as the first layer of ultimate reality, or the fourth density, a realm in which polarity very much still exists. Therefore, the higher vibratory planes of this realm are inhabited by virtuous entities, the good and rational intelligences of nature that an early energetically connected man had a common kinship with, as was discussed previously in this presentation. The lower planes of this initial layer of ultimate reality are inhabited by evil spirits and demoniacal entities, elemental and astral creatures, some of which constitute the mind parasites that were discussed at length in the golden age of psychopathy. It is important not to see the divisions between the planes of ultimate reality as rigid, hard boundaries. Rather, they fade or bleed into one another, much like the colors of the electromagnetic spectrum. Yellow becomes green, which gradually becomes blue, and so on. In addressing such mind parasites, the Golden Age of Psychopathy was an essay that asserted from a metaphysical perspective that psychopathy was a heterogeneous hereditary disorder of the human psyche and constituted a type of low spiritual immunity that readily enticed such mind parasites, as the psychopath lacked the spiritual resonance necessary to activate specific parts of their genetic coding, genetically and epigenetically responsible for proper neurophysiological development. Thus, the modality of consciousness emitted by the psychopath was an energetically compatible, vibratory and oscillatory frequency of consciousness, capable of interfacing with these malevolent fourth density beings. This is noteworthy particularly because of the rulership's self-evidently acute psychopathic behavior, as well as their obvious proclivity for practicing black magic and sorcery in the manipulation of society today. Such malevolent ultra-terrestrial intelligences are known to operate in hierarchies, as such a dark spiritual infection, a cancer, has influenced the hierarchical organization of modern society itself. Thus, such entities are known to operate under the leadership of an overarching predatory consciousness, known by the Gnostics as Yaldabaoth or the Demiurge, and identified by numerous mystical traditions under a variety of identities, such as the fallen angel and his 10 princes. As we explored in the astrotheological narrative, the dark bestowal of restrictions upon man's divinity, only to be transmuted into the gifts that they truly represent, illustrates that the planetary intelligences too adhere to this polarity. Thus, a planet can be seen to have a lower malevolent conscious nature or entity operating from the negative planes of the first layer of ultimate reality, but also a higher benevolent being, the planetary god that we return our restrictive vestments to once we have transmuted such energetic adornments from vice into virtue. It is also quite possible that each planet can be seen to be comprised in its totality of one overarching entity itself, with higher and lower natures, and that such an entity can be communed with in a manner dependent upon the spiritual integrity of the magician, That is, the lower or higher nature, the quality of the human practitioner's consciousness, may energetically determine the nature of the supernatural consciousness they choose to behold. Manly P. Hall tells us, quote, "The majority of modern mediumistic apparitions are but elemental creatures masquerading through bodies composed of thought substance supplied by the very persons desiring to behold these wraiths or decarnate beings," unquote. This does not mean that such entities are not real. Rather, their appearance and persona very much are influenced by the magician seeking to collaborate with them. Such demoniacal entities are notoriously clever, and often impersonate or take on a variety of different appearances, personas, and names, most often for deceptive, tactical purposes. In returning to the septenary model of the solar system and the astrotheological narrative, such lends deeper insight into Christianity's septenary 7 vices or 7 deadly sins of the devil. There are such colorful and diverse explanations for this malevolent presence that it is extremely difficult to find agreement upon the origin and nature of these evil entities. What is agreed on, however, is that such forces indeed exist, can be influential upon the affairs of men, and that such demonic intelligences can be summoned and collaborated with in the furtherance of human aspirations. And this brings us to the second tenet of black magic. By way of the occulted processes of ceremonial magic, it is possible to contact these intelligences and gain their help in human undertakings. It is important to realize that such an activity in itself is not evil. Rather, all manner of invisible creatures can be contacted, good, bad, and everything in between, and such forces can be collaborated with by human beings possessing the proper approach and attitude. To make the blanket statement that all such magical acts are works of the devil is to fall prey to conditioning, as elementals from the Greek perspective were known as daemons, and very much included the good and rational intelligences of nature. Yet religious dogma later labeled all such invisible creatures as evil demons, which had extremely detrimental consequences for man and his natural connection to nature. Man historically has had a very intimate relationship with the various inhabitants of the elements, and modern followers of fantasy, popular fairy tales, and folklore most likely resonate with such memes and concepts because it rekindles race memories of an earlier magical time on Earth within them. Such elementals can of course be divided into the 4 primary elements, namely earth, fire, air, and water. These elements have a gross substantive quality, but also a subtle vaporous essence behind their physical nature, and this subtle essence comprises the spiritual constitution of the invisible inhabitants of the elements. The earth element of ancient philosophies has been metamorphosed into carbon, the fire nitrogen, the air oxygen, and the water hydrogen. The beings that are known to comprise these elements are often termed elementals or nature spirits, and are real living entities, many resembling human beings in shape and form, who very much inhabit worlds of their own, entities and worlds unknown to modern man because of both his underdeveloped senses, but also his tendency to pompously and naively consider himself as being the most valid and important experiencer in all of nature. To communicate with such intelligences requires a gentleness and a humility that upholds the validity and importance of the life experiences of such creatures. One must approach them with honor and integrity, not considering oneself as any more or less real or important than they are. In such magical, shamanic, and eventually natural explorations of the 4th density realms, one inevitably comes across the darker, mean-spirited creatures who interface with the imagination of the human practitioner, attempting to scare or strike fear in the individual, so that such entities can then parasitically feed upon the fear-based consciousness, the lower vibratory, higher density energy that they have inspired. In such occasions, it is extremely important to realize the incorruptible, unpossessable nature of one's inner life force, that the individual has a living power within themselves, infinitely more good, loving, and powerful than the fractured modality of being they embody, an eternal nature that such entities lack yet greatly desire. Pity is thus a much more appropriate reaction than fear, and eventually with practice, one can become indifferent to such encounters. The darker hearts among men have traditionally looked toward the more insidious inhabitants of the invisible realms for help in human undertakings, and such demoniacal entities were and are more than happy to oblige them. Again, I encourage the listener to suspend their belief or disbelief, rather to instead approach such information holistically, taking care to think and intuit such things and consider this information in light of one's own felt experiences. Approaching such unconventional, challenging information using solely the intellect is nearly impossible, though it can still be done with a reasonable understanding of superphysics. Yet such still only allows for the possibility for such things to exist. In order to gain a more insightful, direct apprehension of the intelligences of the astral and fourth density realms, such requires both sacred masculine and feminine modalities of awareness, an activation of both hemispheres of the neocortex in order to lift the veil of Isis, the lunar veil of imagination, fully realizing and directly experiencing that the products of the human imagination are not, for lack of a better term, imaginary, rather that contained within the energetic portal between the brain's left and right hemisphere is a powerful holographic reality generator, more infinitely complex than any man-made computer algorithm will ever produce, a faculty that is literally divine, and is made specifically to interface with the infinite array of nature's many intelligences, and also to actively contribute to the infinite majesty of existence itself. The natural human being, when operating with their faculties of perception transmuted into the gifts that they truly represent, is incomparably more powerful, beautiful, and dynamic than anything that transhumanist technology will ever produce. That any external manipulation of nature by such a grossly imbalanced worldview will ever produce, and that to compare such things, with all due respect to the proponents of transhumanism, is literally laughable. So we thus see this veil of Isis, this veil of imagination, and how it is an absolutely primary hurdle separating scientific materialists and transhumanists alike from adequately understanding the true power and abilities that human beings possess. And one said ability, of course, is the communion with the invisible intelligences of nature, often by, but by no means always dependent upon, the secret processes of ceremonial magic. Good spirits are known to willingly lend their assistance to any worthy enterprise, but evil spirits serve only those who live to pervert and destroy. And this is because evil, in all its manifestations, is not eternal, but is subject to entropy. And without a fuel source, which is conscious energy of the same oscillatory and vibratory frequency, usually an octave lower, however, it cannot be sustained. Therefore, such demoniacal entities serve only to pervert and destroy, because it is this very energy created by this perversion and destruction that allows them to continue to propagate and function in our world. Which now brings us to the third tenet of black magic. It is possible to devise contracts with these spirits, whereby the magician becomes for a stipulated period of time the master of an elemental being. Because such entities operate outside the normal restrictions of time and space, employing the services of such an entity would grant the black magician seemingly supersensory insight and abilities, particularly if they, through ritualistic processes, have interfaced or blended their consciousness with the entity. True black magic is performed with the aid of an entity constituting a demoniacal consciousness, a being who serves the sorcerer for the length of their earthly life, with the understanding that after death, the soul of the magician shall become the servant of his own demon. And it is here that we come to the crux of our metaphysical speculation pertaining to the emergence of transhumanist technologies. Because the dark occultist understands that with death he then becomes the servant of his own demon, it is for this reason that such black magicians are known to go to inconceivable ends to prolong their physical lives, because there is literally nothing for them but enslavement beyond the grave. Historically, such attempts for life extension have resulted in necromancy, vampirism, and other ceremonial rituals, as any and every conceivable method to avoid and prolong one's life has been bargained and negotiated. With the ruling class of today's empire, whose genesis can be literally traced back to the black magicians of Atlantis, We can quite reasonably speculate that they have bartered the eternal soul of their entire genetic lineage, their racial soul. As the golden age of psychopathy speculated, they may have done such a thing because of an historic and ongoing communion with an overarching predatory consciousness, their god, considering themselves to be such an imposter god's so-called chosen people. It is quite reasonable to at least speculate, because the Empire has historically been so apolitical, serving only to further human suffering and propagate debased human consciousness, that they have indeed collaborated with an overarching demoniacal consciousness, perhaps whom the Gnostics called the Demiurge and his legion of astral parasites, in order to farm humanity as an energy resource. As such an evil consciousness no doubt requires debased human energy as a sustainable resource. In exchange for the very spiritual integrity of themselves and their progeny, through both meticulous interbreeding and their service to maintain the suffering of humanity, they have largely been able to avoid or prolong relinquishing the eternal soul of their people. By interbreeding with one another, and by way of very specific ritualistic processes devised from antiquity, they have been able to transfer souls from body to body generationally, so as to prolong the inevitable. Perhaps by crafting a societal and paradigmatic environment that would produce transhumanist ideologues and the development of transhumanist technologies, their intent may be twofold. 1. To most efficiently control human consciousness and maintain it at a certain debased level by technologically collectivizing it in order to optimally sustain the entropic consciousness of which they have since antiquity collaborated with. And 2. To utilize the technological byproducts of their transhuman society to extend their own lives and avoid an eternal enslavement that they bartered away long ago, since the dawn of civilization itself. And it is on this very intriguing note that we wrap up part 2 of this presentation. I had originally intended for this to be comprised of 2 parts, but I think I'd like to devote perhaps another hour to the subject, as I had intended to more adequately explore the technological trends leading humanity toward a transhuman future. Thus far, we have explored science in its current degraded manifestation, and we have seen how it has inspired the reactionary movement of transhumanism. We have now also explored science as it originally existed in antiquity, and have linked the natural, astrological, and alchemical transmutation of man, the grand cycle of human evolution, to the perverse, utopian fantasies of transhumanist figureheads. We have lifted the veil of imagination, and have shown that such a lunar vestment is a primary hurdle separating esoteric man from modern materialists and transhumanists alike. We have also now explored the tenets of black magic in the context of elitist illuminism, and have linked such dark acts to possible motives for the emergence of transhumanist technologies, as well as a motivation for the emergence of scientific materialism itself. So thanks for listening, and stay tuned for part 3 of Left Hand Apotheosis, Transhumanism and the Rulerships Quest for Godhood. Okay, so this talk begins part 2 of Left Hand Apotheosis, Transhumanism and the Rulerships Quest for Godhood. In part 1 we explored the mainstream definition of transhumanism and applied it to the Hegelian dialectic, or problem-reaction-solution, dialectical technique of social manipulation. We saw how the paradigm, or the dogmatic adherence to the paradigm of scientific materialism, provided the problem. That transhumanism itself was the reaction to these problems caused by scientism, and that the occult elite's post-human globalized society was the preconceived solution. We saw how, much like other religions, scientific materialism itself was held together by group assumptions, that allegiance to the paradigm was held in higher esteem than actual experiential results, and that born from this dogmatic ideology came the reactionary movement of transhumanism. We saw that transhumanism's most popular and influential proponents lacked true holistic intelligence, and were broken men and women who were deliberately propped up and paraded as experts, authorities, and intellectual visionaries on the subject, and that this, and the consensus immersion in gross physicality, the increasing reliance on technology, an incorrect and myopic view of history, and the 3 instilled social dynamics of collectivism or hive mentality were all artificially instilled reactionary social trends leading humanity toward a transhuman future. We explored that the transhumanist movement openly proclaims that it wishes to transform what it is to be human. And because the dogmatic adherence to scientific materialism is so severe, transhumanists are heading toward an unknown end, most likely eternal nothingness. When they adhere to such a perverse paradigm, then they ignorantly and naively see transhumanist technologies as a solution, a way to outsmart the unfortunate pitfalls of nature and rise above them. They see death as something to be cheated, and that the prospective void of eternal nothingness that awaits a brain ceasing to fire its synapses can be avoided. That intellect could be infinitely enhanced and combined with all others in collective unity and oneness. All these contrived ideas each function like transhuman carrots hanging from the stick of scientific materialism, as humanity unwittingly gives chase into the trap of their own enslavement, altogether losing what it is to be human. There is of course nothing wrong with wanting to be something more, and even nothing wrong with wanting to eventually transcend the human form and become something even greater. But how can one become something more than human if they have yet to figure out how to holistically be a human in the first place? One of the primary selling points being pushed by the figureheads of transhumanism is the fantasy of a future technological utopia, a future type of paradise where man would be relieved of all pain, conflict, and suffering. Not only is such thinking supremely naive, but it also represents a fundamental misapprehension of the nature of life and of growth. The promotion of this premise of less effort, less pain, and more happiness is in direct opposition to how human beings approach reality when their consciousness has not been artificially conditioned to perceive strictly from five-sense reality in a societal environment that promotes instant gratification, not the most important component in the life and future of the collective. In facilitating such a cooperative role with himself and nature, and the vast living universal organism of which he was a part, early man patterned his approach to life after the great teacher that was nature, and early science was undoubtedly founded upon this relationship. The two oldest sciences known to our world are alchemy and astrology, and in exploring these two great scientific arts, we will see that they in fact work hand in hand with one another, and that in our exploration and integration of both, we will come to understand that they not only reveal great truths, but they help the individual achieve what is sometimes known as palingenesis, or the resurrection of the soul from the material organism. Indeed, these are the philosophical arts of spiritual rebirth, of true spiritual awakening, and by their usage, the journey of the human soul can once again move to the forefront of human aspirations, so that the individual can actively and consciously contribute to their own evolution. Now, it should be said that these ancient systems are by no means the only way to spiritual liberation. The individual contains all the tools necessary within himself to facilitate a boundless relationship between himself and ultimate reality by virtue of his own unique felt experiences. We refer to these systems, however, with the understanding that they were devised by fellow human beings who, like the modern seeker, were seekers in their own right, and honorably devised philosophies of being from their own genuine desire for truth, and thus by reviewing what they compiled for the nation through minimal effort. For indeed there is something much more important than living in blissful, effortless happiness for all eternity, and to answer what that something might be in a wise and adequate manner, we must ironically refer to science as it originally existed in antiquity. After spending a large portion of Part 1 elucidating the problems and shortcomings of science in its current degraded manifestation, it is only proper to continue by first exploring science as it existed in the ancient world. And in doing so, we shall see the sheer depth, beauty, and astonishing wisdom that was devised by our ancestors. Wisdom that can be unlocked within ourselves today, as the veracity of such early truths was so great that they exist on eternally within us. They are one with the very essence that ensouls who we are. Today's division of essential learning into all its various competitive and non-cooperative fragments has destroyed the synthesis of this knowledge. Learning has been divided into countless isms and ologies, departments and subdepartments to such a fractured degree that these disciplines no longer optimally serve us in a constructive manner. In the ancient world, science, religion, and philosophy were all one thing. Spiritual matters and the physical sciences were fundamentally unified in a kind of universal science that represented a more holistic attitude in regards to how man approached not only his life on earth, but the greater journey of the human soul. And it is the journey of the human soul that remains, despite the current consensus paradigm, the most valid and important consideration in the life of the individual. And whether humanity realizes it or believe their ideas of so-called bettering humanity are considered to be, and designed to appear to be, the only possible option for moving forward. When the illusion of no other choice is sufficiently instilled, that choice is consensually made. To elaborate on this point, because the occult rulership in their own way adhere to universal law, they largely avoid infringing upon free will by not directly forcing technology on others. Although the covert integration of nanotechnology via environmental factors is most definitely an ongoing practice, something we will cover later in this presentation, yet nonetheless, the rulership still focus the bulk of their attention on crafting a proper social environment that will lead people to accept the integration of technology into their lives, and eventually even their bodies willingly, by choice of their own volition. Some may call this manipulation coercion, and that it still represents a violation of universal law, and they may have a good point to say so. Nonetheless, the massive amounts of willful ignorance, of complex ignorance on humanity's part, certainly is a huge factor that offsets much of the rulership's infringements upon free will. In a paradigm where people think of themselves as having no power, that their life is short, unfair, and ends with infinite death, when they are told that humans arose out of the war to keep breeding, eating, and reproducing, and are a mutation of randomness and ruthlessness, the product of a kind of accidental mix of chemicals that led to a primordial slime that eventually evolved into Homo sapiens, living only to pass on genetic material to their progeny, and that they are inevitably